Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this video I wanted to go over tank theory crafting efforts in World of Warcraft, starting from vanilla World of Warcraft and eventually going into the current expansion. This will be at least a two-part video series that will begin with talking about tank theory crafting efforts as a whole, and will eventually lead to being more specific to Blood Death Knight theory crafting in the second video. That being said, the game has been out for a long time, and we are dealing with a broad subject matter, so this won't necessarily be all-inclusive, but it will be giving a condensed outline. When it comes to World of Warcraft, the progression of damage calculations has been pretty straightforward. Back in the good old days, people had spreadsheet models for damage optimization, but players eventually moved over to using simulations for damage calculations, which, at least for damage metrics, provided more pros than cons. Damage is a relatively simple metric to work with the main point of development over the years mostly having to do with making the process of optimizing for damage extremely streamlined, and, for those willing to dig a little deeper, very accessible for deeper analysis. All things considered, simulating damage is easy compared to some metrics that some of the other roles need to deal with. While damage is also of relevance to tank and healers, and is similarly easy for them to measure, they each also have other complications to deal with when it comes to measuring survivability and healing effectiveness. However, this is a tank video, so we don't really care about those healers right now. While measuring damage output is relatively straightforward, discussions about how to measure tank survivability bounced around to a number of possibilities that the community never fully rallied behind. That being said, most early metrics were either directly or indirectly related to effective health, or EHP. I'm going to jump ahead in time for a second to provide some context on how tanks operated in older expansions versus how they operate now. Tank survivability arguably comes in two forms. It can either come in the form of mitigation, which includes anything that reduces healing requirements from healers onto the tank, or it can come from effective health increases, which directly or indirectly increase the size of your health pool and makes you more resilient against burst damage, even if it doesn't necessarily decrease the amount of healing you need from other players in your group or raid. A pure form mitigation stat is self-healing, which directly reduces the need for other players to heal you while doing nothing to protect you from burst damage directly. Meanwhile, stamina is the opposite, since it increases your health pool without directly reducing the damage you are taking or providing any sort of offsetting benefit. It will help you survive burst damage, and that's it. Meanwhile, a large amount of defensive metrics do both to some extent. They directly reduce incoming damage, which both improves your likeliness to survive burst damage while also reducing your ultimate healing requirements. While tank self-healing would eventually become a significant part of their survivability kit, older expansions did not provide many significant self-healing mechanics to most tank specializations, which is why initial tank theory crafting conversations generally focused on effective health and adjacent metrics. In addition to effective health itself, which just corrected health for effective damage reduction, time to live was thrown around as a metric for how long a player could survive in a given fight encounter from full health to 0% health without any healing taken in between. Furthermore, some players began to use damage taken per second from logs as a crude way to compare tank performance. That said, this brings up the first community concern with some of these early metrics, which has to do with damage smoothness. Even if you had two tanks that had similar effective health or damage taken on average, a number of players advocated that there was value in having damage intake be more predictable for any given amount of effective health or damage taken. One way this took shape was in players paying special attention to the hit table. Attacks against the player are categorized based on a single roll table. If you manage to increase your parry by 1%, this causes 1 out of every 100 attacks to be a parry instead of a normal hit. Normal hits are what happens when the attack doesn't get categorized into any of the other rows. So normal hits are what normally get overridden when any of these other categorizations become more prominent. That being said, if you are able to increase the values of parry, dodge, miss, and block sufficiently, it was possible to reduce normal hits to 0%. The table values in this case are for a player hitting an NPC, where the opposite would have been more appropriate. But you can get it to the point where every attack that you can't avoid altogether is blocked. This was a threshold that was valued by some portion of tank players at the time. That being said, the value of defensive consistency is something that doesn't have a clear consensus even today. Reasonable people would agree that Tank B has a preferable incoming damage profile to Tank A, but the harder questions come up when you are asking how much of a price you are willing to pay for that damage intake consistency. The second concern that would arise in the earlier expansions was the relative value of pure effective health compared to the hybrid metrics that provide both mitigation and effective health. Optimizing for one or the other very often led to different decisions being made on how you would build your character. This would be a good time to mention the impact of Vengeance, a mechanic that arose during Cataclysm and reached peak power in Mists of Pandaria before ultimately being removed. In its original inception, tanks would gain attack power from damage they have taken recently that allowed them to gain up to 10% of their maximum health in attack power. Now, what was this mechanic trying to accomplish? You see, Blizzard was concerned that as an expansion continued and the power of a player's items would get stronger, tanks would be investing their gear in improving their survivability, while damage dealers would be investing their gear into improving their damage, which would increase the damage gap between the two roles over time. And, in their view, they wanted threat to function similarly throughout an expansion, instead of getting more difficult to manage over time. Interestingly enough, there's also a statement in a blue post from 15 years ago that states that proper threat balancing is seen as a factor of keeping tanking enjoyable. If threat was too easy, the tanks apparently wouldn't be having fun. I just thought some people might find that one interesting. If you are confused to how Vengeance is supposed to combat late expansion threat scaling, I am speculating that stamina may have scaled more aggressively than other stats back in Cataclysm. And, since the attack power you gain is limited by max health, this could mean that the attack power bonus indirectly had good scaling into the later half of the expansion. I was not able to confirm this in the research for this video, however, so this is speculative. That said, the first of Vengeance's failings showed up even in this first iteration of it. You see, the damage bonus from Vengeance would begin to decay if you were not taking enough damage frequently enough to keep the buff at full power. So, with the way this works, there are situations where you can increase your personal damage by taking avoidable damage. Maybe you decide to stand in that fire circle in the ground, and maybe we just conveniently decide not to use our defensive cooldowns so we can take more damage. And when Mists of Pandaria came out, Vengeance was uncapped for a few months, which further added fuel to this fire. It is also important to talk about the progression of parse culture over time. While damage meters were developed fairly early, we didn't really see public combat logging come up until Wrath of the Lich King. And while some of this transition began occurring in Cataclysm, by Mists of Pandaria and moving into Warlords of Draenor, we start to see log performance and eventually damage parse rankings as being a form of social currency for player credentials. And, despite creating a conflict of interest, tanks were not immune to parse culture. That said, especially during peak Vengeance power in Mists of Pandaria, it wasn't too uncommon for tanks to out-damage DPS role players, so this was certainly an era where the impact of tank damage had a relatively high value in the raid compared to every other expansion. At first, Blizzard tried to get this situation under control with targeted tuning to stop certain damage types from contributing to Vengeance, and reinstituted an attack power cap on it shortly after Mists of Pandaria began. But eventually they just threw in the towel on Vengeance and replaced it with a short-lived mechanic called Resolve in Warlords of Draenor. Resolve removed the damage-increasing aspects of Vengeance and replaced it with a self-healing increase. But this had nothing to do with the original purpose of Vengeance. It made tanks harder to balance against each other, and it wasn't an intuitive mechanic. And so the mechanic was ultimately unimpactful and was later removed at the end of Warlords of Draenor. While the experiment of these mechanics was ultimately a failure, I would argue that one of its lasting impacts was that it removed the notion that tank damage should be completely ignored, even though the opposite position becomes a problem in later expansions. With that context out of the way, the next major milestone is the development of TMI, where things started to get fancy, though perhaps a little too fancy. Before Mists of Pandaria, tanks were relatively passive in their defensiveness. They just sat there taking a beating while healers would take the driver's seat and making sure that the tanks didn't run out of health. Mists of Pandaria represented a design philosophy change, where tanks now had a lot of abilities that relied on proper timing to negate incoming damage well. Whether we are talking about Shield Block, Death Strike, Guard, Frenzied Regeneration, or Shield of the Righteous, among other things. Bosses also began to start using tank busters more regularly, along with other similar mechanics that switched up their rate of damage output to reward good usage of these active mitigation abilities. Blizzard wanted tanking to be more engaging for players and to reward tanks for good active gameplay decisions. Furthermore, the movement towards combat log comparisons and damage parsing made the absence of an equivalent simulable survivability metric a lot more noticeable than before. For the most part, survivability metrics were still operating in the spreadsheet space, while simulation, at the time, looked like a good future development direction for defensive metrics. The Thek-Mallory Index was particularly concerned by both the lack of a simulable metric for survivability and the inability of older effective health metrics to account for what is being called damage smoothness, especially in an era of World of Warcraft where enemy damage output was now spikier, and timing-sensitive abilities had a larger focus in this version of the game. As such, the development of TMI began, and I'm going to attempt to explain this metric as simply as humanly possible. Let's say we have a 5-minute raid encounter. We are going to look at a 6-second rolling average window that slides across all 5 minutes of this encounter, and for each rolling average, we are calculating the following value, which is effectively unmitigated damage taken in relation to player health, adjusted for self-healing. The worst of these windows was then taken and exponentially scaled into a final output where low TMI was associated with a stable tank and high TMI was associated with an unstable tank. The important thing to note here is the very high emphasis on the worst case spike. Yes, this metric does put extra value on supposed damage smoothness, but it is putting a lot of value on this worst case spike in particular, to the point where unreliable effective health benefits are heavily punished if they even benefit this metric at all. So, to some extent, this is just a complicated indirect measure of reliable effective health. Now, if it wasn't obvious just due to how it works, TMI was primarily developed for use in Simulationcraft, which was also the established method of measuring damage output at the time and today. Similar to how you could use Simulationcraft to optimize your character for maximizing damage, the idea was that tanks could use Simulationcraft to maximize their characters with regards to TMI. You could also calculate this metric from combat logs, though it was generally thought to be less effective in that application. In any case, the metric creators thought this metric would be more representative of overall tank survivability than the metrics that came before it, and that the integration with Simulationcraft would allow players to optimize and evaluate themselves around this metric more easily. However, there was some skepticism about this metric, to say the least. As mentioned before, there was a lot of emphasis that could be placed on very infrequent damage spikes, and the fact that no other events were factored into the calculation at all was off-putting to some. Even if the calculation ultimately had to have some arbitrary elements, this still seemed like a rigid assumption, since it didn't differentiate tank effectiveness in situations where burst damage isn't an issue, and it might be over-penalizing inconsistent forms of mitigation. Second, even if people could look up how the metric was calculated, it was still hard to interpret what its practical impact was on player outcomes. The output was also very contextual for a given fight and would require constant calibrations to get it to work properly, which further increased the difficulty in interpreting it and applying it to real gameplay. Even if you were getting a bad TMI from a sim, it wasn't obvious what was causing the issue and how to fix it. At least with damage sims, you could diagnose the problem relatively easily. As a result of these problems, as well as a change in overall game tuning, we would see some new metrics arise in Warlords of Draenor to try and improve effective tank measurements. First thing to note is that this is around the time when significant self-healing tank mechanics start to come into play, which opens the door for optimizing more heavily for raw mitigation instead of mostly operating in metrics that are oriented around effective health. At this point in time, meaningful self-healing metrics are more prominent on only certain tank specializations like Blood Death Knight, but these mechanics are starting to show up in Warlords of Draenor on all tanks in some capacity, before being greatly expanded upon in Legion. Furthermore, raid encounters are starting to become more scripted and predictable, while tanking tools were numerous and strong enough to the point where tanks were better equipped to deal with anything the boss threw their way, which made dying from burst damage a lot less of a concern than it had been historically. And if burst damage is no longer as much of a concern, then all of a sudden we are caring a lot more about mitigation than effective health, which, at the end of the day, is all about making the healers' lives as easy as possible by requiring less healing from them for a given amount of incoming damage. The most basic of the resulting metrics was championed by Ask Mr. Robot, which pushed healing required per second as an updated tank metric. The calculation for this is pretty straightforward, since we are mostly just looking at damage taken and subtracting out any heals or absorbs that the tank is able to perform on themselves. That said, we also had other takes on tanking metrics, such as Kira's Resolve-Weighted Survivability Index. Detailed documentation was hard to find on this one, but from what I gather, it was primarily based on 50% external healing required per second and 50% TMI as a starting point before applying other adjustments. From what I found, this is the first time someone has combined a mitigation and an effective health metric to represent overall survivability. As for the adjustments, the goal was to try and craft a competitive tanking metric such that it wouldn't introduce problematic incentives for tanks. So different types of incoming damage were weighted differently depending on if they were related to active tanking, unavoidable environmental damage, or avoidable damage to make sure soaking certain types of damage wasn't incorporated in the strategy to boost the metric, as well as how often the tank was actually tanking the boss, since tanks would obviously require less healing if the boss was almost never attacking them, and when they were being attacked, they would have more defensive cooldown of time available for these windows if they just weren't tanking the boss a lot at all. There were likely other parts of this calculation, but regardless of how exactly it worked, it was abandoned after one expansion of its use. So it probably wasn't without its own problems. Still, there are aspects to this attempt at quantifying survivability that were innovative for its time. Now, starting in Legion, a lot of things change all at once that affect the state of tank theory crafting in World of Warcraft in major ways. Up to this point, most meaningful theory crafting communications occurred in various forms. Elitist jerks had been in decline for a few years at this point in time, but things like MMO Champion and the different class and spec-specific forms were part of the community landscape and held a lot of the substantive theory crafting discussion during this period. However, in Legion, we started to see the mass migration over to Discord servers. Discord provided a speed of communications that forms just couldn't match. Discord servers could serve as a one-stop shop where players could ask a question about anything and get an answer sometimes in seconds, on top of having integrated voice chat capability. That said, this transition wasn't all upsides. When you move from forums to chat rooms, the incentive for quick replies directly conflicts with making informed, longer-form posts, while looking up any previous knowledge in these servers is not nearly as effective as looking up knowledge from forums. For example, like if you're using just a regular search engine like Google, you can actually find information from forums from that, and you're not going to get anything from Discord servers because it just doesn't work that way. So while theory crafting doesn't necessarily go extinct due to this, it becomes a lot more fragmented, since the new medium for communication does not naturally incentivize these types of conversations for theory crafting, and in some cases can even actively suppress it. One way this fragmentation came about is that a lot of the theory crafting efforts past this point become specific to individual tank specs rather than the overarching efforts we had seen before, and are often fragmented even within the individual tanking specializations themselves. Collaboration between theory crafting contributors simply declined across the board because of this, because everyone was kind of on their own islands at this point. But we also saw changes in how the game was being tuned. While we saw things trending in the direction of more predictable raid encounters, with tanks having a large number of tools to work with in Warlords of Draenor, things kept trending in this direction moving into Legion. Bosses started doing more consistent damage with less hard-to-predict burst windows. We moved from active to rotational mitigation, which is still more engaging than passive mitigation, but removes the emphasis on reactive gameplay to one of general resource management. Expanded self-healing mechanics on tanks have made them less reliant on external healers to sustain themselves. All in all, raid tanking just becomes easier for the vast majority of players in Legion and beyond compared to older expansions. And with raid tanking being in a particularly easy state, this reduced interest in survivability metrics altogether, at least for a time. This was reflected quickly in Simulationcraft, which, for the most part, stopped supporting the incorporation of defensive mechanics for tanks, and mostly decided to just focus on modeling damage alone. The previous survivability metrics have always been a bit squirrely, to be fair, and supporting them takes a lot of extra work, and the current raid environment just didn't seem to warrant the effort. But the result of this path is that it started to create a massive blind spot in knowledge for what contributes to tank survivability altogether. Despite the environmental factors turning against it, Ask Mr. Robot persisted for a few years and made a few additional developments, such as the tough metric. The whole basis of tough is that it argued that the chance of the tank surviving an encounter is ultimately the main thing any tank metric should be measuring, which is a good point and not particularly controversial. But how they tried to measure it leaves some concerns. Basically, they were attempting to simulate a raid encounter with simulated enemies, simulated healers, and simulated tanks, to try to account for all aspects of any given raid encounter that could affect whether the tank lives or dies. This spits out a percentage between 0% and 100% that is meant to gauge your survivability effectiveness as a tank, that is based on a combination of how likely you were to die in this type of simulation and what proportion of incoming damage you ultimately mitigated. Trying to simulate all of these aspects is not inherently wrong, but we are dealing with a lot of moving parts for an output that is very specific to the inputs. Even before this point, the creators of TMI had advocated against modeling healers directly because it could mask innate tank effectiveness and overcomplicate the interpretation of any output, which I believe were valid concerns, especially since tanks are generally looking to see what they can do to improve their personal survivability independent of any fixed healer behavior. In any case, Ask Mr. Robot also started dabbling in methods that sought to create builds that are meant to be optimal blends of tank survivability, as defined by the tough metric, and damage, realizing that both of these metrics had contextual value, that you might want to do something more nuanced than simply maximizing for one or the other. The most valuable findings I have colored in green, which is that they think a survivability metric should be closely related to the probability of a tank surviving, the fact that they realize that the ideal optimization strategy might be to find an intermediate blend of damage and survivability metrics, and that this is the first time someone has been formally using a real measure for effective mitigation. Any effective mitigation measure is ultimately going to be some manipulation of both external healing requirements on the tank, as well as the raw incoming damage before it is reduced by any mechanics. So this will generally come in the form of a percentage for total incoming damage mitigated, which is what Ask Mr. Robot was utilizing, or there are cases where it is appropriate to show it in an alternative form, such as a factor, where, for example, a tank might be able to soak a certain amount of unmitigated damage per point of external healing they require. The nuances between different mitigation measurements and why you might want to use different measures in different circumstances isn't really relevant until much later. In any case, Ask Mr. Robot started fading into obscurity beginning in Battle for Azeroth, and its demise is largely attributed to the factors making survivability less of a concern for raid tanks overall, and the continued rise of raid bots. And so, in the wake of all these changes, things were trending in a very simplistic direction for tanks. If raid tanking was going to continue to be easy, why not just lean heavily into treating tanks as damage rolls with easier rotations? Even if survivability still has a non-zero value in raid, and you could improve optimizations with that information, the cost of not knowing much about the subject would be small, and you save yourself a lot of effort not looking into these mechanics in detail. Pure damage optimization would still cover a majority of the needed information you would need to know. If tank survivability was reasonably assured in most circumstances, damage becomes the only way tanks can contribute to the success of their raid, as long as they don't go too far in removing their survivability benefits. Additionally, on a more visceral level, pushing raid damage might be the only way raid tanks can even make the game interesting and feel like they have any sort of meaningful skill expression with modern raid tuning. Now, it is worth pointing out that none of this is necessarily true for players who are clearing the raid extremely quickly to fight pre-nerf boss encounters with minimal player power. In these circumstances, there are certainly times when the tank may be more routinely threatened and need to consider an appropriate blend of damage and survivability. Though you do get an interesting dynamic where some community managers are so heavily invested into the pure damage maximization model that they get angry at higher-end raiders considering anything else and attempt to besmirch them in the WoW community. Now, if raiding in World of Warcraft was all there was to this story, this would probably be the end of it, where Tank Theorycrafting has mostly devolved into treating tanks like easy-to-play damage dealers that are only showing up to raid at all because they are required for strictly mechanical reasons, and where most of the significant tank-specific theorycrafting efforts beyond damage maximization have heavily corroded. However, one other thing comes about in Legion to change the landscape of what goes into optimizing a tank effectively, which is where we will start with the next video. While this video is not yet directly related to Blood Death Knight Theorycrafting, which is what I normally do, feel free to stop by the Blood DK Analysis Discord if you want to talk about Blood Death Knight Theorycrafting, general Mythic Plus questions, or if you want a Mythic Plus log review. The channel Discord information, as well as my personal Discord contact information, is in the video description below. And if you want to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.